Imagine an entire family simply vanishing into thin air without a trace. In 1888, the Ashworth family did just that, leaving behind a house frozen in time and a mystery that has baffled investigators for over a century. What if everything you thought you knew about historical disappearances is wrong? Get ready to uncover the unsettling truth behind the Ashworth Enigma. It was the kind of English countryside village you'd expect to find painted on a postcard. Rolling green fields, a slow, flowing brook, and cottages whose chimneys puffed lazy curls of smoke into the crisp morning air. In the summer of 1888, Ashworth Village seemed untouched by the turmoil of the outside world. Here, life followed a rhythm so predictable, it was almost comforting. Children fetched water from the well. Farmers worked their fields from dawn to dusk. Neighbors greeted one another by name. Among the families who lived here, none were more well regarded than the Ashworths. Jonathan Ashworth, a man in his 40s with a reputation for fairness and a mind for trade, owned the local mill. His wife, Margaret, was known for her warm smile and skill with herbal remedies. They had 3 children: William, the eldest at 15, who helped his father at the mill; Clara, 12, who had a gift for sketching; and little Thomas, barely 8, with a laugh that could melt the sternest heart. On the morning of June 17th, life in Ashworth Village seemed as ordinary as any other. Neighbors saw the family moving about their home early in the day. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the sound of laughter drifted across the lane. By mid-morning, the house stood silent. No one thought much of it at first. Perhaps they had gone into town. But when evening came, and no sign of them returned, concern began to ripple through the community. The next day, the village constable, Henry Lyle, visited the Ashworth home. What he found was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The front door was unlocked. Breakfast plates sat on the dining table, half finished, as though the family had been interrupted mid-meal. A teapot still steamed faintly, the fire in the hearth smoldering low. Upstairs, beds were unmade, clothes lay neatly folded on chairs, and personal belongings. Watches, jewelry, even Margaret's wedding ring, remained untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, no letters, no farewell, no clue. It was as if the Ashworth family had simply stepped out of existence. Before we dive deeper into this haunting mystery, tell me, what do you think could make an entire family vanish without a trace? Drop your theories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chilling chapter. By the time the sun rose on June 18th, the quiet concern of the villagers had hardened into alarm. Word spread quickly. No one had seen the Ashworths since the previous morning. Constable Henry Lyle organized a search party, a mix of neighbors, farmhands, and a few curious onlookers. They began by combing the house once more, determined to find any detail the constable might have missed. Every room was exactly as it had been left, food on the table, clothes folded neatly, and the faint scent of lavender from Margaret's soaps lingering in the air. But then came the first unsettling detail. William's boots, muddy from the previous day, sat by the back door, still damp. This meant the boy had been home recently, perhaps moments before the disappearance. As the search widened to the garden, orchard, and nearby brook, the oddities multiplied. In the soft earth beside the well, they found a single teacup, its porcelain cracked, half buried in the mud. There were no footprints around it. Not from boots, not from bare feet, nothing. The searchers fanned out into the surrounding fields, calling the family's names into the wind, but the countryside replied with only the rustle of grass and the distant caw of crows. Some villagers whispered of bandits or highwaymen, but the absence of stolen goods made this theory seem hollow. Others muttered about more unsettling possibilities. Old folklore about the taking, a superstition that spoke of spirits stealing away entire households on nights when the air stood still. In the early afternoon, a pair of men ventured into the mill where Jonathan Ashworth worked. The machinery was silent, the grindstone still. On Jonathan's desk lay a ledger open to a half-finished entry, the ink blotched as though the pen had been dropped mid-word. No one could explain why a man so meticulous would leave his work undone. By dusk, the search party had found nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a sign of struggle, not even a broken twig to suggest hurried flight. The Ashworth home was locked up, but to the villagers it now seemed less like a house and more like a shrine to a life interrupted. As darkness fell, people returned to their own homes, locking their doors and whispering to their children to stay inside. The silence that settled over Ashworth village that night felt heavier, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Before we explore the strange theories that began to swirl after this fruitless search, share in the comments. What would you suspect if this happened in your town? And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next revelation in the Ashworth Enigma. Whispers and theories in the village. By the morning of June 19th, the Ashworth disappearance had already shifted from an urgent search to a story that seemed to stalk every whispered conversation in the village. People spoke in hushed tones at the bakery, lingered longer than necessary outside the post office, and exchanged glances when passing the shuttered Ashworth home. Theories multiplied like weeds in an untended field. Some insisted it must have been foul play. Perhaps Jonathan had enemies from the mill trade, a dispute over grain prices or land. But those who knew him scoffed. Jonathan was fair to a fault, respected by both customers and competitors. Others leaned into the supernatural, recalling the old stories that had been passed down for generations. The most popular of these was the night takers. Shadowy figures, said to appear without sound, spiriting away those marked by fate. Few admitted to believing such tales outright, but even the most skeptical found themselves locking windows that had never before been latched. A smaller, quieter faction proposed that the Ashworths had left of their own accord. This theory puzzled most. Why leave without money, clothes, or even a horse? And why abandon half-eaten food and an open ledger? Some pointed out that Margaret had recently been seen reading a letter at the market, her brow furrowed, but no one knew its contents or where it had come from. Constable Lyle, determined to remain grounded in reason, began digging into the family's history. He interviewed friends, relatives, and even distant acquaintances. Nothing hinted at a reason for them to leave, nor any looming danger. The family's finances were sound, their relationships free from scandal. It was as if they had been living the most ordinary of lives. Until the moment they weren't. By week's end, the search parties had stopped, replaced by a strange, almost fearful acceptance. The Ashworth home became a landmark of unease, a place children dared each other to touch before running away. A month later, a traveling newspaper man came through and heard the story. His article, titled, "The Vanishing Ashworths, a Family Gone Without Footprints," would ensure the case spread far beyond the sleepy boundaries of the village. And with each retelling, the mystery deepened, the facts becoming more shadowed, the silences more ominous. Now, more than a century later, we still ask, what truth lies buried in Ashworth village? Comment your wildest theory below, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in unraveling this enigma. Outsiders enter the investigation when the article about the Ashworths appeared in a regional paper. It caught the attention of more than just curious readers. Within days, 2 outsiders arrived in the village. Inspector Gerald Whitcomb from London and Dr. Elias Morton, a scholar of forensic science, a field still in its infancy in 1888. Whitcomb was a tall man with a sharp gaze, known for solving several high-profile missing persons cases in the city. Morton, on the other hand, was quieter. His interest rooted less in law and more in the scientific puzzle such vanishings presented. Their arrival caused a stir. Some villagers hoped they would succeed where Constable Lyle had failed. Others resented the intrusion, suspicious of strangers poking into local matters. The first stop was, of course, the Ashworth home. Whitcomb methodically examined every room, his gloved hands brushing over surfaces, eyes scanning corners for overlooked details. Morton moved slower, crouching to inspect the hearth ashes, the plates on the table, the boots by the door. He noted the strange fact that while the house showed signs of life abruptly halted, there was no dust disturbed anywhere, as though no one had moved through certain rooms in weeks, even though witnesses swore the family was seen the morning before they vanished. Outside, they studied the grounds. Morton found a patch of grass behind the house, where the blades seemed unnaturally flattened in a perfect circle, roughly 6 feet across. Whitcomb questioned neighbors about this, but none recalled seeing anything unusual in that spot before the disappearance. That evening, in the village inn, the two compared notes. Morton proposed that the flattened grass could suggest the placement of a large, heavy object, or perhaps something pressing down from above. Whitcomb dismissed it as coincidence, but his tone lacked conviction. Over the next several days, they expanded the search radius to miles beyond the village. Farmhouses, barns, even abandoned mines were inspected. Nothing linked to the Ashworths was found. At one point, a local farmer reported seeing a strange light in the sky the night before the family vanished, but he was ridiculed into silence by his peers. Still, Morton made a private note of it. By the time Whitcomb and Morton prepared to leave, the case was no closer to being solved. But Morton, in a letter to a colleague, wrote, "This is no ordinary disappearance. I feel we are looking at the edge of something beyond our understanding." What do you think that something could be? Share your guess in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll be here when we uncover the next layer of the Ashworth enigma. Dr. Morton's private notes. Elias Morton left Ashworth Village outwardly unsatisfied, his public stance aligning with Inspector Whitcomb's official report. Cause undetermined, investigation suspended pending new evidence. But in the privacy of his lodgings in London, Morton's notes told a very different story. Written in a tight, meticulous script, his diary entries revealed an obsession with the case that lasted long after he stepped away. He began with an analysis of the flattened grass behind the Ashworth home, sketching diagrams of its perfect circular shape. Too precise for livestock, too isolated for human machinery of the day, he wrote. Possibly atmospheric, yet no scorch marks, no indication of fire. He also documented an anomaly he had not shared with Whitcomb. While inspecting the family's bedroom, he noticed that a silver pocket watch on Jonathan's nightstand had stopped at precisely 9:47. More unsettling, Margaret's small travel clock in the adjacent room was frozen at the exact same minute, though neither clock was wound down completely. To Morton, this hinted at a sudden, simultaneous disruption. Something powerful enough to halt mechanical movement, without damaging the devices themselves. He listed possibilities ranging from magnetic interference to electrical disturbance, a term not yet widely understood in 1888. His research led him to accounts of other, smaller disappearances in rural England. Incidents where individuals vanished without a trace, sometimes leaving meals uneaten or fires burning in the hearth. The earliest he could find dated back to 1792. The most recent had been just a year before the Ashworths vanished. All occurred in isolated locations, all without signs of struggle, and in 3 of the cases, witnesses reported unusual sounds or lights in the sky beforehand. Morton began corresponding with a handful of fellow scholars willing to entertain unconventional ideas. One, a professor in Edinburgh, speculated about atmospheric vortices, capable of transporting objects or people across distances instantaneously, a notion Morton found both improbable and disturbingly fitting. He also filed away the local legend of the takers, wondering if such folklore might have roots in a misunderstood natural or unnatural phenomenon. Still, Morton kept these thoughts to himself in official circles, weary of ridicule. "Science," he wrote, "is not yet ready to face what I believe may be the truth. And yet, In the final line of one entry, he left a haunting clue. If the Ashworths were taken, they were not the first, and God help us, they will not be the last. What's your take? Natural phenomenon or something far stranger? Leave your theory in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the revelations still to come in this chilling mystery. Echoes in the village. Years passed, and while life in Ashworth village slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, the absence of the Ashworth family remained a shadow that never quite lifted. The house, inherited by a distant cousin, sat mostly empty. No one wanted to live there for long. Tenants reported sleepless nights, strange drafts, and the unnerving sensation of being watched. By 1893, 5 years after the disappearance, the first of what the villagers would later call haikus began. It started with Mrs. Hensley, a widow who lived across the lane. One evening, she swore she saw Margaret Ashworth in the upstairs window, standing motionless, her hands resting on the sill. When Mrs. Hensley called out, the figure stepped back and vanished. That same week, a young shepherd claimed to hear children laughing in the Ashworth garden at dawn. When he approached, the air turned unnaturally still, and the laughter stopped instantly, leaving him shaken. The most unsettling incident came that autumn. A blacksmith named Daniel Price was returning from the inn late at night when he noticed light spilling from the Ashworth kitchen window. Curious, he peered inside and froze. The family was seated at the table exactly as they'd been described in the constable's original account. Breakfast plates half finished, Jonathan holding a teacup midair, as if frozen in time. But then Jonathan slowly turned his head toward the window and looked directly at Daniel with an expression that Price later described as both pleading and warning. Panicked, Price stumbled backward, tripped over the garden fence, and when he looked again, the room was dark and empty. Whispers of these encounters spread quickly, reigniting old fears. Some believed the family was caught between worlds, appearing only when certain conditions aligned. Others thought it was a cruel hoax, though no one could explain the consistency of the details. Strangely, these haikus seemed to occur every few years, always in late summer or early autumn, and always to individuals who were alone. In 1895, the house was boarded up entirely, but this did little to stop the stories. The sightings became less frequent, but the fear remained. By the turn of the century, the Ashworth Enigma had transformed from a tragedy into something far darker. An unsolved riddle that refused to fade. If you were in that village, would you dare step inside the Ashworth home after dark? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe so you're here when we uncover the next chilling layer of this mystery. The journalist's obsession. In 1901, more than a decade after the Ashworth family vanished, a London-based journalist named Samuel Harrington stumbled upon the old newspaper clipping titled, "The Vanishing Ashworths, a Family Gone Without Footprints." Harrington, known for chasing unsolved cases and mysteries dismissed by the police, was instantly hooked. He traveled to Ashworth village with the intention of writing a short feature, but what he found there pulled him into an investigation that would consume the next 2 years of his life. Upon arrival, Harrington was struck by how reluctant the villagers were to speak. Even those who hadn't been alive in 1888 avoided the topic, as if uttering the Ashworth name risked inviting trouble. The old Ashworth house stood boarded up, its garden overgrown, the windows clouded with years of dust and neglect. Despite warnings from locals, Harrington managed to convince the property's caretaker to grant him entry. Inside, the air was heavy, stale with disuse, yet strangely intact, as though the rooms had been frozen in the very moment the family disappeared. Harrington took meticulous notes, sketching the layout and photographing what he could with his cumbersome camera equipment. In Jonathan's old study, he found the ledger Whitcombe had described, still open on the desk, the ink stain faded but visible. He also discovered something Morton had never mentioned publicly, a folded piece of paper wedged deep inside the ledger's spine. On it was a single, hastily scrawled line. "It is here." There was no signature, no context. Determined to learn more, Harrington sought out surviving witnesses, including Daniel Price, the blacksmith who claimed to have seen the family years after their disappearance. Price, now an old man, was reluctant to revisit the memory, but eventually described the same scene he had told others, right down to Jonathan's unsettling stare. Harrington began to suspect that the Ashworth case might not be a closed chapter, but an ongoing phenomenon. He stayed in the village for weeks, hoping for an ICO sighting. None came, but on his final night, something strange occurred. As he packed his belongings in the small inn, every clock in the building stopped at 9:47, the exact time Morton had recorded in his private notes. The next morning, the clocks ticked normally again. Harrington never found an explanation, but his notes grew more urgent after that night. If you were him, would you stay and push deeper, or leave before whatever took the Ashworths decided to take you? Comment your choice below, and subscribe so you're ready for the next chapter in uncovering this haunting mystery. Patterns across the globe. Back in London, Samuel Harrington pored over archives, railway logs, and international news clippings, determined to see if the Ashworth disappearance was truly unique. Within months, a disturbing pattern began to take shape. In 1871, a farming family in rural France, 5 members, vanished overnight, leaving food on the table and a clock stopped at 9:47. In 1880, a small homestead in Ontario, Canada was found deserted, plates still warm, the family dog sitting unharmed by the hearth. Again, the clock in the kitchen had stopped at 9:47. Most unsettling of all was a case from 1896 in a coastal village in Norway, an entire household gone. Clothes left folded on chairs, a kettle boiling over, and witnesses reporting a pillar of light rising from behind the home the night before. The detail that froze Harrington's blood was the time noted in the local constable's report, 9:47. In every instance, there were no signs of violence, no theft, no footprints or wagon tracks leading away, just an absence, like a story ripped from the page mid-sentence. Harrington created a map, marking each disappearance. Though separated by vast distances, the locations formed an unsettling, loose pattern. Points on what could almost be an invisible circle spanning the globe. If such a shape meant anything, Harrington didn't yet know, but he began to suspect the events might not be random. The deeper he dug, the more resistance he met. Local officials dismissed his inquiries, colleagues urged him to drop the story, and a senior editor at his paper warned him directly, "Some mysteries stay buried for a reason, Samuel." But Harrington refused to stop. He reached out to Dr. Elias Morton, now retired and living in quiet isolation. To his surprise, Morton agreed to meet, saying simply, "If you have found what I think you've found, then perhaps it's time the truth was spoken aloud." When they met weeks later, Morton brought with him a leather-bound journal filled with notes, sketches, and diagrams, more detailed than anything he had shared with the public. It was here that Harrington first saw the words Morton had underlined 3 times in red ink: synchronous event. Before we reveal what Morton believed this meant, what do you think could cause identical disappearances across continents at the exact same minute? Share your theory in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next revelation in the Ashworth Enigma. The synchronous event theory. When Harrington pressed Dr. Elias Morton to explain the phrase, the older man leaned forward, his voice low, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Synchronous event, Morton began, is the simultaneous occurrence of an anomaly in multiple locations, each connected, though separated by vast distances. Not a coincidence, not a chain reaction, but one thing happening everywhere at once. He flipped open his leather-bound journal to a page filled with diagrams, concentric circles, intersecting lines, and notes about magnetic fields. In each case, the Ashworths, the French farmstead, the Canadian homestead, the Norwegian coast, the conditions were strikingly similar. clear skies, still air, early evening in the local time zone, and a precise cessation of all mechanical motion at exactly 9:47. Whatever occurred, it did so across these points in the same instant, as though reality itself hiccuped. Harrington frowned, skeptical but intrigued. "Are you suggesting some kind of global phenomenon?" Morton didn't hesitate. "I'm suggesting something acted upon these places at the same moment, with the same precision, as if following a map we cannot see." He tapped the invisible circle Harrington had drawn on his own map. "You've nearly outlined it without realizing. These points form part of a geometric pattern. What shape it completes, I can't yet say. But I believe there are more points, more disappearances, hidden from public record." Morton went on to recount an incident he'd never published. In 1890, he had been summoned quietly to a manor in Devonshire, where the occupants had vanished in the same manner. Officials covered it up, citing a domestic relocation. But Morton had seen the stop clocks for himself, both frozen at 9:47. "Whatever this is," Morton said, "it does not appear often. But when it does, it takes entire households removed without sound or trace. The only constants are the time, the suddenness, and the silence." Harrington asked the question that had been gnawing at him since the Ashworth house. Why them? Why these families? Morton's gaze grew distant. "That," he said, "is the part I fear most. It may not be about who they are at all, but where they are when the moment comes." If you heard this theory, would you dismiss it as paranoia? Or start watching the clock each night? Let me know in the comments. And make sure you subscribe, so you don't miss the next chilling piece of this puzzle. Journey to the Norwegian coast. Harrington and Morton agreed that if they were to uncover the truth, they needed to see one of the other disappearance sites firsthand. After reviewing Morton's journal and Harrington's map, they chose the coastal village in Norway where the 1896 event had occurred. It was remote, isolated by rocky cliffs and icy waters, but Morton believed the location geography might reveal clues the others did not. They arrived in late August, the wind off the North Sea, carrying a sharp chill even in daylight. The village was small, fewer than 30 homes, and the locals, much like those in Ashworth, were wary of outsiders. Through a translator, Harrington learned that the house where the family had vanished still stood, untouched since that night. A fisherman named Olav, who had been a boy at the time, reluctantly agreed to guide them there. The house sat at the edge of the cliffs, its wooden walls bleached silver by salt and time. Inside, the air was dry and cold. Dust coated every surface. Yet on the kitchen table lay 3 plates, their contents long since rotted away, but positioned as if waiting for their owners to return. On the wall above the hearth hung a brass clock, its hands still fixed at 9:47. Morton studied the scene in silence before turning his attention to the cliffside behind the house. There, embedded in the rocky ground, was a shallow depression roughly 6 feet in diameter, perfectly circular. The grass around it grew in a slightly different shade, as if the soil itself had been altered. Olav admitted he had seen a strange light there the night before the family vanished. Like the sun, but silent and gone in an instant. His father had forbidden him from speaking of it again. As evening fell, Harrington and Morton set up camp nearby, determined to observe the location overnight. Around 9:30 the wind died completely, and the air grew unnaturally still. Harrington noted the sudden silence of seabirds, the absence of waves against the cliffs. At precisely 9:47, the brass clock inside the house gave a faint click, though no one had touched it. Morton's watch stopped dead in his hand. 30 seconds later, it started ticking again. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Something had happened, something they could feel in their bones, even if they could not see it. If you were in their place, would you keep investigating? Or leave before the next event struck? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you're ready for the next turn in the Ashworth Enigma. Tracing the pattern back in time, the strange moment on the Norwegian cliffs haunted Harrington and Morton long after they left. Back in London, they decided to push the timeline of their research further, digging not just into the 19th century but into older, less formal records. Parish archives, handwritten ship logs, private family diaries passed down for generations. What they found was both thrilling and unnerving. The earliest possible connection came from a weathered journal kept by an English monk in 1624. In one passage, he described a godless taking, in which a household of 5 vanished from their cottage near the River Wye. The monk noted that all the household's possessions remained, their meal untouched, and a time candle in the hall burned out at the exact mark it should have reached by 9:47 in the evening. In 1710, a Dutch merchant ship's log recorded the sudden loss of its captain and 3 crewmen during calm seas. The entry noted that the ship's hourglass was inexplicably stalled mid-flow, the sand frozen in place for what the remaining crew swore was a full minute or more, before resuming. The date, when converted to local time, aligned with the same evening hour, 9:47. In 1758, in the rural outskirts of Prague, a land surveyor detailed the disappearance of a family from a farmhouse, their supper set, clothes folded, and a metal pocket watch in the father's coat pocket stuck forever at 9:47. As the list grew, so did the geographic spread: isolated farms, coastal homes, mountain villages. All far apart, yet all touched by the same moment, centuries apart. Morton began sketching these events onto a massive map pinned to his study wall. The more points he added, the more it resembled a repeating geometric lattice, a pattern echoing across time and continents. "This isn't random," Morton murmured one night. "It's as if something visits." Harrington, who had spent years chasing frauds and false leads, found himself unable to dismiss what they were seeing. If these events spanned centuries, then the Ashworth family's fate was just one chapter in a much older and larger story. The question now was whether the pattern pointed to a cycle, and if so, when it might strike again. Would you want to know the date of the next synchronous event, or would you rather never find out? Comment your answer below, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chilling step in unraveling the Ashworth enigma. The countdown theory: it was late one night in Morton's study when the breakthrough, or perhaps the curse, came. Harrington had been sorting through the scattered records they'd gathered, arranging each event chronologically. As he did, he noticed something: the gap between incidents wasn't random. When measured precisely, the disappearances seemed to occur in intervals that shortened over time. In the 1600s, the gap spanned centuries. By the 1700s, they were down to decades. By the late 1800s, mere years. If the pattern held, another event could happen not in decades, but in months. Morton, leaning over Harrington's shoulder, began calculating. His hands shook as he wrote the dates and intervals on the map. "If this is correct," he said quietly, "the next occurrence is due this year." They cross-checked the historic coordinates with astronomical and magnetic data. Morton's specialty: a chilling alignment emerged. Each event site fell within a narrow band that shifted slowly over time, as if whatever force was behind the disappearances moved along a fixed path. That path, Morton realized, was about to intersect with a stretch of English countryside, only a day's travel away from Ashworth village. Harrington felt the weight of it. This wasn't just theory anymore. They might actually predict where and when it would happen. "If we can be there," Harrington said, "we could see it with our own eyes." Morton hesitated. "And risk being taken ourselves. If the pattern holds, anyone present when the moment comes could vanish permanently." Still, neither man could deny the pull of the mystery. They began gathering equipment: cameras, measuring instruments, and precise clocks set to the second. Every test they had run pointed to the same date as September 14, 1902, at exactly 9:47 p.m. The location was a small hamlet named Greystone Hollow. The two agreed they would arrive days in advance, study the area, and prepare for whatever might come. Harrington wrote in his notes, "If this is truly a countdown, then each event is not separate, but part of something building, something reaching toward a conclusion. I pray we are ready when it comes." If you knew the exact date and time of a phenomenon like this, would you go to witness it? Or run as far as possible? Share your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next harrowing turn in the Ashworth Enigma. Greystone Hollow. Harrington and Morton arrived in Greystone Hollow on the evening of September 10, 1902, 4 days before the predicted event. The hamlet was smaller than Ashworth village had been, no more than a cluster of stone cottages surrounding a modest green. The locals were polite but reserved, curious about the two strangers claiming to be surveyors, charting the area. They rented a small room above the village's only inn, its window looking out over the surrounding fields. From the first night, both men sensed something unusual about the place. At dusk, the air took on a strange stillness, as if the wind itself were holding back. The village clocks chimed a fraction of a second out of sync, a detail Morton immediately noted. On September 11, they began mapping the area, focusing on a meadow just beyond the last cottage. There, to Morton's quiet dread, they found it a faint, near-perfect circular depression in the grass, roughly 6 feet in diameter, identical to the marks behind the Ashworth house and the Norwegian cliff home. Morton crouched to touch the grass, then pulled his hand back quickly. "It's warmer than the surrounding ground," he said, glancing at Harrington with a look that was half excitement, half fear. Over the next 2 days, subtle oddities began to stack up. A farmer reported that his cows had refused to enter the meadow since early September, lowing anxiously if driven toward it. A group of village children claimed they saw a shimmer in the air above the circle when the sun set, though their parents dismissed it as imagination. Harrington kept the clocks in their room running and checked them hourly. Twice he found the second hand slowing for a fraction of a moment before resuming, always in the minutes leading up to 9:47 p.m. By the evening of September 13, the atmosphere in the hamlet felt heavier. Birdsong stopped earlier than usual, and the villagers seemed to avoid going out after dark. One old woman, overhearing Morton and Harrington in the inn, muttered, "You're chasing the hollowing. Best not to." When pressed, she refused to say more. That night, as they reviewed their notes, Morton confessed that every recorded disappearance before had been preceded by a slight increase in such disturbances. "It's coming," he said grimly. "I think we'll feel it before we see it." If you were them, would you spend the last night inside the safety of the inn? Or camp by the circle to be closer when the moment comes? Comment below and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next in the Ashworth Enigma. The day of the event, September 14, 1902, dawned cold and unnaturally quiet in Greystone Hollow. A thin mist clung to the fields, curling low over the ground like it was reluctant to lift. Harrington woke before sunrise, his mind already fixed on the meadow. Morton was at the desk, meticulously checking his instruments. Barometer, compass, and 3 separate clocks all set to the same second. "We document everything," Morton reminded him. "And we don't step into the circle unless we agree it's safe." Harrington nodded, though neither man truly believed safety was possible if the pattern repeated. Throughout the morning, the village moved in its usual slow rhythm, but there was an edge to it. People glanced at the two strangers longer than before. Conversations hushed as they passed. A few cottages had their shutters closed despite the daylight. Around midday, the stillness deepened. The air grew heavy, and the sound of distant sheep faded until even the occasional bleat felt swallowed by the silence. By 6:00 p.m., the mist had returned, thicker now, pooling in the meadow until the circle was barely visible. Morton's compass needle began to drift in lazy, unnatural arcs. "Magnetic interference," he muttered, scribbling notes. At 8:30 p.m., they set up their equipment at the edge of the circle. 2 tripods with cameras, one aimed at the ground, the other at the sky. Harrington adjusted the lanterns so their light wouldn't interfere with the long exposures. The villagers had vanished indoors, and the only sounds were their own movements and the occasional rustle of the grass. At 9:40 p.m., everything changed. The air grew warm, not gradually, but in a sudden, almost breath-like wave. The mist above the circle began to churn in a slow spiral, though there was no wind. Harrington's watch ticked normally, but Morton stopped dead in his hand. 7 minutes. Morton whispered. They both felt it then. A deep, low hum in their bones, not in their ears. Harrington's instincts screamed at him to run, but his curiosity rooted him in place. The seconds crawled toward 9:47, each one stretching impossibly long. Both men stood at the edge of the circle, every nerve on edge, waiting to see if they would witness history or become part of it. If you were there, would you hold your ground for the sake of discovery or step back before the moment struck? Comment your choice and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the clock hits 9:47 in the Ashworth Enigma 9247. The moment came with no warning, no blinding flash or thunderous sound, just a single, impossible instant when the world seemed to stop breathing. At 947 exactly, every sound in Greystone Hollow vanished. The wind froze mid-gust, the distant creak of a cottage door halted mid-swing, and even the faint hum in Harrington and Morton's bones cut out entirely. The mist over the circle solidified, not into ice or vapor, but into something almost glass, like shimmering faintly in the lantern light. Harrington's camera clicked. He wasn't sure if it captured anything, but his hands moved on instinct. Morton stared at the circle, his voice low but urgent. Look at the center. A distortion had appeared there, like heat haze over stone, but it pulsed rhythmically, each expansion and contraction perfectly timed, almost like a heartbeat. Then, without any visible cause, the grass within the circle bent downward, pressed flat by an invisible weight. The temperature spiked in seconds, forcing sweat onto Harrington's brow despite the autumn chill. Morton's barometer needle swung wildly, then snapped back to 0. From the heart of the distortion came a sound, not loud, but so alien it made the hair rise on their necks. It was neither human nor mechanical, more like the resonance of metal strings plucked in a vast, hollow chamber. The pulsing quickened. The lantern light nearest the circle warped, bending toward the distortion as though pulled by unseen hands. Harrington took a step forward without realizing it, his curiosity overwhelming his fear. Morton grabbed his arm, yanking him back just as the pulsing reached a frenetic pace. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The distortion collapsed inward like water draining from a basin, leaving only flattened grass and silence, so deep it seemed to press on their chests. Then came the most chilling part. 2 sets of footprints appeared in the circle, where none had been before, pressed deep into the earth, leading halfway toward the edge and stopping abruptly, as if their owners had vanished mid-step. Harrington and Morton locked eyes, both knowing exactly what they were thinking. Someone, or something, had just been here. Would you have stayed in that moment to see if it returned, or fled before you became the next to disappear? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next harrowing turn in the Ashworth Enigma. What the photographs revealed back in their room above the inn. Harrington and Morton worked in tense silence, developing the glass plate negatives from the cameras they had set up. The chemical scent of the darkroom solution filled the air as the first image took shape. At first, it showed exactly what they had seen. The misted circle, the flattened grass, the strange distortion in the center. But as the image sharpened, Morton leaned in, his face tightening. There was a figure in the circle. It was faint, as if half-formed, but unmistakable. A tall man, features blurred, standing perfectly still in the very heart of the distortion. His posture was rigid, and his head was tilted slightly, as though looking directly toward the camera. Harrington checked the second plate, taken seconds later, and felt his stomach turn. This time, the figure was closer to the edge of the circle, and behind it, barely visible, were smaller shapes. 3 of them. One appeared to be a woman, the other 2 the size of children. Morton didn't need to say it. They were both thinking the same thing. These figures matched the descriptions of Jonathan, Margaret William, Clara, and little Thomas Ashworth. The third plate, taken moments after the pulsing had stopped, showed nothing but the empty circle again. Except for the fresh footprints they'd seen with their own eyes. Harrington's hands trembled as he held the wet negatives up to the lantern light. "If this is real," he whispered, "then they were here. Tonight." Morton was pale, staring at the images like they might burn through the paper. "And if they can appear," he began, but didn't finish the thought. Instead, he turned to the barometer readings and compass data, noting that the magnetic field had spiked precisely when the figures were visible in the photographs. "This is more than a disappearance," Morton muttered. "It's a displacement. They're not gone. They're somewhere else." Harrington glanced toward the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching from the darkness. "If they're somewhere else," he asked quietly, "what's keeping them there?" Morton didn't answer. He only looked back at the photographs, his expression caught between awe and dread. "If you saw undeniable proof like this, would you spend your life trying to bring them back? Or destroy the evidence and walk away?" Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in the Ashworth Enigma. The experiment Morton was the first to suggest it. If the phenomenon can open, perhaps it can be induced. Harrington stared at him, unsure whether to call it genius or madness. But Morton had already begun sketching a plan. Recreate the exact conditions of the event, same location, same time, same instruments, and perhaps some way to provoke the displacement. On the morning of September 15, they returned to the meadow with their equipment. Morton insisted on bringing a large brass pendulum, a device he believed could detect fluctuations in local gravitational pull. They also positioned mirrors around the circle's perimeter, hoping to catch any distortion from multiple angles. Harrington was uneasy. "You're talking about inviting whatever did this back here," he warned. Morton only replied, "It's already here. We just need to make it show itself." They spent the day preparing, carefully marking every detail. Footprint positions from the night before, compass drift patterns, and the temperature differential in the circle's soil. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the villagers again disappeared indoors, leaving the hamlet silent. At 9:30, the first anomaly appeared. The compass needles began their lazy spirals, and the pendulum swayed in uneven arcs without wind. Morton adjusted the mirrors, aligning them toward the center. The moment the lantern light reflected into the circle, the air shimmered faintly, almost imperceptibly, like heat above asphalt. Morton's barometer needle trembled wildly. "It's close," he murmured. At 9:46, he stepped forward to the edge of the circle, holding an old silver watch he'd deliberately wound to match the time of the previous night's event. "If there's a resonance," he said, "this should trigger it." He placed the watch on the ground inside the circle. Exactly at 9:47, the shimmering deepened, forming that same heartbeat-like pulse. The mirrors caught brief, flickering images, shapes moving just beyond clear focus. Harrington caught one glimpse in the reflection, a pale face, eyes wide, mouth open as if calling out, but no sound reached him. Morton reached toward the watch, but before his fingers touched it, the pulse collapsed. The watch was gone. Not broken, not displaced in the grass. Gone. Harrington stared at the empty patch where it had been seconds before. Morton looked almost exhilarated. "It took it," he whispered. "That means it can take you, and maybe it can give. Would you keep pushing this experiment further, knowing it might take more than just objects next time? Comment your answer. and subscribe so you're here for the next piece of the Ashworth Enigma. Crossing the line by the next morning, Morton was no longer speaking in cautious hypotheticals. "If it can give," he said, "then perhaps we can bargain with it." Harrington felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. The disappearance of the silver watch had clearly emboldened Morton, but to Harrington it was proof of how easily anything, could be taken. Morton's new plan was far riskier. Instead of inanimate objects, he proposed using a living subject. "A rabbit," he explained, producing a small wooden crate. "If it disappears and returns, we'll know it's possible to bring something back. If it doesn't..." He trailed off, as if unwilling to finish the sentence. Harrington argued against it. "You're assuming it will return at all. And what if you're wrong? What if whatever's in there sees the rabbit as an invitation?" But Morton was already setting up. That night, September 15, they waited again in the meadow, crate in hand. The air felt heavier than before, the circle's grass still pressed from the previous night's pulse. At 9:46, the now familiar signs appeared: the magnetic drift, the unnatural warmth, the oppressive silence. Morton placed the crate at the circle's center, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. The rabbit inside shifted nervously, its small movements loud in the stillness. At 9:47, the shimmering began. This time faster, more erratic. The heartbeat pulse grew loud enough that Harrington swore he could feel it in his teeth. Morton stepped closer, notebook ready, eyes locked on the crate. The shimmer thickened, wrapping the crate in a translucent veil. Then, without warning, the rabbit froze mid-movement, every twitch and breath suspended. A split second later, the crate was empty. The veil collapsed instantly, leaving only the wooden box behind. Morton rushed forward, flinging the lid open. Empty, warm to the touch, no trace of the animal. For a moment, neither man spoke. Harrington's voice finally broke the silence. "You just sent a living thing into whatever that is. You don't know where it went. You don't even know if it's alive." Morton closed the crate slowly. "No," he said, "but I know it can take life. And if it can take life, then it can return life." His eyes burned with a strange, almost feverish determination. "Next time we try something bigger. If you were Harrington, would you stop him now? Or let him push further to uncover the truth?" And share your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe so you don't miss the next perilous turn in the Ashworth Enigma. The human test Harrington had dreaded it from the moment Morton first suggested using a living subject. Now, only one night later, Morton was speaking of stepping into the circle himself. "You saw the footprints," he insisted. "You saw the Ashworths on those plates. They're not gone. They're trapped somewhere. If we can make contact, we can pull them back." Harrington's protest was immediate. "Or it can take you, and then I'm left here with nothing but more questions and one less friend." But Morton's mind was set. He spent the day making preparations. A length of rope tied to his waist, the other end anchored to a tree at the meadow's edge, a pocket watch set to local time, and a small flask of chalk powder to scatter in the circle if he found anything on the other side. Harrington agreed to one condition: if Morton felt any pull or distortion, he would step back immediately. As darkness fell on September 16, the meadow was unnervingly still. At 9:45, the shimmer began without delay, stronger than either of them had seen before. The pulse thudded in their bones, and the air seemed to bend around the circle's edges. Morton tightened his grip on the rope, glanced once at Harrington, and stepped inside. The moment his boot crossed the threshold, the shimmer wrapped around him like a veil. His features blurred in Harrington's sight, as though viewed through rippling water. "I can hear something," Morton called out, his voice strange, muffled, like coming from behind a wall. Harrington shouted for him to step back, but Morton took another pace toward the center. Then everything happened at once. The rope went slack in Harrington's hands. Not loose, but weightless, as if nothing was attached to the other end. Morton's outline wavered, stretched, and then snapped out of sight entirely. Harrington lunged forward, holding the rope, but it came back clean, the knot still intact, with no sign of Morton. The shimmer collapsed instantly, the pulse gone. The meadow was empty. Harrington stood frozen, rope in hand, staring at the circle where his friend had been seconds before. In the grass near the center lay a single object, Morton's pocket watch, stopped at 9:47. Would you keep searching for him, risking the same fate, or leave before the phenomenon returned? Let me know in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed for the final chapter of the Ashworth Enigma. The last attempt. Harrington did not sleep that night. Morton's disappearance replayed in his mind in a relentless loop. The shimmer swallowing him whole, the sudden slack in the rope, the pocket watch in the grass. By dawn, Harrington had made his decision. He could not leave Greystone Hollow without knowing what had happened. The next day, he prepared as Morton had, but with one addition: a journal strapped to his chest, its first page already filled with a single message. If this is found, I went willingly. At sunset, the village seemed abandoned. Even the innkeeper avoided his eyes. Harrington returned to the meadow and found the circle exact as it had been, the grass pressed flat, the air unnaturally still. He checked his watch. 9:44. 3 milling. He scattered chalk powder around the edges, hoping it might leave some trace behind if he vanished. At 9:46, the pulse began heavier than ever before, vibrating in his teeth and bones. The shimmer flared into being, brighter and denser, its surface shifting like molten glass. Harrington took a deep breath and stepped into the circle. The effect was immediate. The air thickened, his movements slowed, and sound became distant, muffled. Through the haze, shapes began to form. Vague at first, then sharp. He saw Morton, pale but alive, standing beside a man who could only be Jonathan Ashworth. Behind them, Margaret held the hands of the children. They seemed solid, real, but their eyes held an unspoken urgency, as if warning him back. Harrington reached toward Morton, and for a heartbeat, their hands touched. Then a force like a rushing tide pulled them apart. The pulse quickened, the shimmer tightened, and the figures blurred again, receding into a vast, featureless void. Harrington felt the ground vanish under his feet, falling, floating, it was impossible to tell. And then nothing. When the villagers ventured out the next morning, the meadow was empty. The chalk powder remained, undisturbed, and in its center lay Harrington's journal, its pages blank except for the single message he had written. The watch he'd carried was gone. Neither Harrington nor Morton was ever seen again. Over the years, others would claim to see faint shapes in the Greystone Hollow meadow at dusk. 2 men among a family of 5, standing silently in a perfect circle, waiting. If you had the chance to step into that circle knowing you might never return, would you take it? Comment your answer below and subscribe, because some mysteries once opened never truly end.